The sun hung low over the rolling plains of central Nebraska, casting a golden haze across Highway 81. Dust swirled gently in the wake of a 1969 Indian Chief motorcycle, its deep, throaty rumble cutting through the quiet of late afternoon. At the handlebars sat Dan Whitaker, 78 years old, his weathered hands steady, his gaze locked on the open road. His silver hair caught the breeze beneath a faded leather cap, and his lean frame, toughened by decades of discipline, moved with the bike as if they were one. To anyone passing by, he was just an old man on an ancient bike, a relic of a bygone era. But Dan Whitaker was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary ride. 10 miles outside the small town of York, Dan's modest ranch sprawled across 40 acres of cornfields and pasture. For 35 years, he'd risen at 4:30 every morning, tending to his land with the same precision he'd once applied to his military missions. His 1965 Ford tractor had given out yesterday, clutch plate shot, and he knew exactly which part he needed to fix it. A lifetime of wrenching on engines, from tanks and deserts to bikes and garages, had taught him to diagnose a machine's ailment by sound alone. The Indian chief parked in his weathered barn was his lifeline to town. Its chrome was pitted, its black paint chipped, but it roared to life every time. That was enough for Dan. Flash didn't matter, function did. At 78, Dan rode with a grace that shamed men half his age. His reflexes, honed by years of training in high-stakes operations, remained razor-sharp. He could spot a deer darting across a field at 300 yards, or sense a car drifting too close before it even crossed the line. Situational awareness, a gift from his past, never left him. But the world rarely sees what lies beneath the surface. An old man on a beat-up bike? Just a curiosity, a footnote. The irony stung, though Dan had long stopped caring. Those with the most to offer are often the ones dismissed, as having nothing left to give. The traffic light at York's main drag flickered red. Dan eased the Indian to a stop beside a Sunoco station, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The bike's rumble echoed off the brick facades of the diner and hardware store across the street. A few locals glanced over, some with nostalgia, others with mild disdain. Dan ignored them, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. Then, in his side mirror, he caught the flash of red and blue. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, its lights pulsing. Dan's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed steady on the grips. He'd faced worse than this. Officer Emily Carter, 26, stepped out of the cruiser, her boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Her mirrored aviators reflected the fading sun, and her hand rested casually on the holster at her hip. 3 years on the York PD, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. Her partner, Officer Ryan Delgado, 29, followed, his easy grin masking a hint of boredom. "What's this, Pops?" Emily called out, her tone laced with mockery. "You joy-riding Grandpa's relic or what?" Dan didn't flinch. He sat still, hands on the handlebars, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon. The officers exchanged a glance. Emily's smirk met Ryan's raised eyebrow. "Sir, kill the engine and step off the bike," Emily said, her voice sharpening. "Now!" Her hand hovered closer to her weapon, a reflex born of training but edged with impatience. Dan reached down slowly, switched off the ignition, and let the Indian's rumble fade into silence. He dismounted with deliberate care, his movements fluid despite his age. "License and registration?" Emily demanded, holding out her hand. Dan reached into his worn denim jacket, pulling out a battered leather wallet. He handed over the documents, everything neatly folded, his military ID tucked behind his driver's license. Emily snatched them, her eyes narrowing as she scanned his birth date. 78 years old, she said, half to herself, half to Ryan. "Don't you think you're pushing it riding this thing at your age?" Ryan circled the bike, inspecting it like a used car salesman. "Man, this heap's older than my mom," he said, chuckling. "Look at that rust. Bet it's a death trap." He leaned closer, squinting at the faded paint. "Hands on the bike, sir. Spread your feet." The order was unnecessary, and they all knew it. A pat down for an old man at a traffic light? It was theater, not procedure. But Emily nodded, and Ryan complied, his hands quick and perfunctory. A small crowd began to gather, locals pausing on their way into the diner, a couple of teens filming on their phones. Whispers rippled through the air. What's he done? Poor guy, probably confused. Cops got nothing better to do? Dan stood motionless, hands on the Indian's handlebars, his face unreadable. Emily stepped closer, her voice louder now, as if addressing the crowd as much as Dan. Mr. Whitaker, where you headed? You live out by Route 81, right? All alone? Alone, Dan said, his voice low and steady. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Emily's lips pursed. Got family? Someone looking after you? The question dripped with assumption, as if Dan were a stray dog wandering too far from home. I've been looking after myself for 78 years, he replied, his tone calm but firm. Emily's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. She didn't like the answer, or the way he gave it. Listen, sir, she said, stepping even closer, her voice rising. Riding a bike like this at your age, it's dangerous. You can hurt yourself or someone else. Dan didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the horizon, hands now clasped behind his back. The silence unnerved her. I'm talking to you, she snapped. You hear me? I'm listening, Dan said, his voice unchanged. Then answer the question, Emily pressed. Don't you think it's reckless riding this junker? What if your reflexes aren't what they used to be? Ryan leaned in, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide his words. Might be hard of hearing, Em. Look at him. Just standing there, barely reacting. Emily raised her voice, enunciating each word like she was addressing a child. Mr. Whitaker, can you hear me? Do you understand what I'm saying? The crowd grew thicker, their murmurs louder. Poor old guy, he does look lost. Somebody call his family. The world split, as it often does, between pity and judgment. Nobody knew Dan's story, and nobody asked. Across the street, at the Sunoco station, the owner, Tom Brady, 55, paused while cleaning a pump. A Desert Storm vet, Tom had known Dan for a decade. Every week, Dan filled up the Indian's tank, paid in cash, and shared a few words. Always polite, always sharp. Tom watched the scene unfold, his gut twisting. He knew Dan wasn't just some old-timer. The man carried himself like someone who'd seen things, done things that most couldn't imagine. Tom's hand reached for the phone behind the counter. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, off at Air Force Base 30 miles away. This is Tom Brady, he said, his voice urgent. I need to speak to an officer on duty. It's about one of your own. Back at the intersection, Emily's frustration boiled over. Dan's silence, his unshakable calm, felt like defiance. Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice now a command. You're coming with us to the station. We need to evaluate whether you're fit to be on that bike. Dan finally turned his head, meeting her gaze for the first time. His eyes were clear, piercing, the kind that could silence a room. On what grounds? He asked, his voice still low but carrying a weight that made Ryan shift uncomfortably. Emily hesitated, caught off guard. For failure to comply with a lawful order, she said, grasping for authority, and for behavior that suggests you might need a medical evaluation. The word sounded hollow even to her. There was no law against being old, no regulation mandating a psych eval for riding a motorcycle. But the crowd was watching, phones still recording. Backing down now would mean admitting she'd overstepped. Dan's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition. He'd heard flimsier excuses from greener recruits, from enemies in far darker places. He'd faced interrogations with higher stakes than this, in jungles and deserts where a wrong word meant death. This was nothing, but it still stung. Not for himself, but for the principle. A man's dignity earned through decades of service, reduced to a spectacle at a traffic light. Officer Carter, Dan said, his voice steady. May I ask you something? Emily stiffened. She didn't like this shift, the way he'd taken control of the moment. What? She said, her tone clipped. How long have you been on the force? Dan asked. The question was simple, but it landed like a challenge. Emily's jaw tightened. 3 years, she said. Why? Dan nodded, as if confirming something to himself. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crowd sensed the tension, their whispers falling silent. Something was about to shift. They could feel it. And they were right. Far down Highway 81, a low rumble grew louder. Not a motorcycle this time, but something heavier. Tom Brady, still by the phone, stepped out of the station, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, kicked up by a convoy of military vehicles speeding toward York. Dan Whitaker had no idea, but the past he'd left behind was about to catch up with him. The air in York, Nebraska grew thick with tension as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. At the intersection of Highway 81 and Main Street, Daniel Dan Whitaker stood beside his 1969 Indian Chief motorcycle, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes unyielding against the sharp commands of Officer Emily Carter. The crowd's murmurs swirled, some laced with pity, others with judgment. As phones recorded every moment of the standoff, Emily's voice, sharp and impatient, cut through the hum. "Mr. Whitaker, get in the vehicle now. That's an order." Dan's faint smile, barely visible, held the weight of a man who'd faced far greater threats than a young officer's bravado. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Across the street, Tom Brady, the Sunoco station owner and Desert Storm veteran, gripped the edge of his counter, his heart pounding. The call to Offutt Air Force Base had been brief but urgent. "One of your own's in trouble," he'd said, his voice tight. Daniel Whitaker, 78 years old, getting harassed by local cops for riding his bike. The officer on the line had gone silent for a moment, then asked, "Did you say Whitaker?" The tone shifted, urgent, almost reverent. "Hold tight, Mr. Brady. Keep eyes on him. We're sending a unit. Do not let them take him anywhere." The call ended, and Tom stepped outside, his boots crunching on gravel as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't know Dan's full story, but he'd seen enough of the man's quiet strength over the years to know this wasn't just about an old man on a bike. Something bigger was at play. Back at the intersection, Emily's patience frayed to its breaking point. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm not asking again," she said, her hand inching toward the cuffs on her belt. "You're coming with us for an evaluation, or we'll make this harder than it needs to be." Officer Ryan Delgado shifted uneasily, sensing the crowd's growing unease. The teens filming leaned closer, their whispers turning to gasps. "She's gonna arrest him? He's just an old guy." Dan's gaze remained steady, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You've got no cause, officer. No law says I can't ride my bike. So tell me, what's this really about?" Emily froze, her authority shaken by the quiet power in his words. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of support and outrage. "Leave him alone," called a woman from the diner's doorway. "He's not hurting nobody." But Emily doubled down, her pride stung. "It's about public safety," she snapped. "You're a risk, sir. At your age, on that bike, you're a danger to everyone." Dan's eyes flickered, not with anger, but with something deep. He'd heard those words before, in different forms, in different wars. Dismissal, doubt, the assumption that a man's worth could be measured by the lines on his face or the rust on his machine. Then it came, a low, guttural roar from the south, growing louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Heads turned. The crowd parted as dust rose on Highway 81, a storm kicked up by a convoy of military vehicles. 12 Humvees roared into view, their engines snarling like a pack of wolves. They screeched to a halt in a precise semicircle, boxing in the intersection. 50 soldiers spilled out, their rifles slung, but their presence unmistakable. From the lead Humvee stepped Major Nathan Caldwell, 52. A grizzled officer with 25 years of service etched into his weathered face. His eyes locked onto Dan, and he strode forward, ignoring Emily and Ryan entirely. The soldiers moved as one, forming a silent, disciplined line behind Caldwell. He stopped 3 paces from Dan and snapped a crisp salute, his voice steady but resonant. "General Whitaker, sir." The word general hit the air like a thunderclap. Emily's hand dropped from her cuffs, her face paling. Ryan's grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. The crowd fell silent, phones still raised but now trembling in their hands. "General? This old man in a faded jacket on a rusted bike. Caldwell turned to Emily, his eyes cutting through her like a blade. Who's responsible for this? He demanded. Emily stammered, her confidence crumbling. I'm Officer Carter, York PD. We stopped this. Gentlemen, for safety concerns, his age, the condition of his bike. Caldwell's voice rose sharp and unyielding. First gentleman is Lieutenant General Daniel Whitaker, 3-star general. Retired, he served 4 tours. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. He led covert ops that saved countless American lives. He trained thousands of soldiers, including me. This man holds a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Medal. You stopped a living legend of the United States Army because of his age? The crowd gasped, a collective wave of awe and shame washing over them. The teens' phones kept rolling, but their whispers turned reverent. A general? He's a hero? Oh my God, they messed up. Emily's mirrored sunglasses hid her eyes, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Ryan stepped back, muttering, "We didn't know, sir. We were just doing our job." Caldwell's gaze didn't soften. Your job is to protect, not to shame a man who's given more to this country than you'll ever understand. He turned back to Dan, his voice softening but still formal. General, are you all right, sir? Do you need assistance? Dan's eyes softened, the faintest trace of warmth breaking through his stoic mask. I'm fine, Major. Just heading to town for a tractor part. Appreciate you coming, though. The soldiers stood taller, their formation a silent testament to the man before them. Dan's gaze swept over them, and for a moment his mind flashed back decades ago. Jungles thick with heat and danger, deserts where the air burned, young soldiers looking to him for guidance. He led them through hell, brought most of them home. Now, here they were, or men like them, standing for him. His throat tightened, but he swallowed it down. No tears, not here. Emily found her voice, though it shook. General Whitaker, sir. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. Dan turned to her, his eyes piercing but not cruel. Officer Carter, he said, his voice low. It's not about who I am. It's about who you think you can judge without knowing. Every soul you meet carries a story, scars you can't see, battles you'll never know. You assumed I was less because of my age. That's the mistake? The words landed like a quiet detonation, rippling through the crowd. A woman in the back, her face lined with years, wiped her eyes. A man in a trucker hat bowed his head, muttering, Damn. He's right. The teens stopped filming, their phones lowering as they absorbed the weight of the moment. Tom Brady, still watching from across the street, felt his chest swell with pride and pain. Pride for Dan, pain for the humiliation he'd endured. He'd seen it before. Veterans dismissed, their sacrifices forgotten, their strength reduced to stereotypes. But this was different. This was justice. Caldwell stepped closer to Dan. Sir, do you need an escort? We can take you wherever you're headed. Dan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. No, Major. This old bike's got me this far. It'll get me the rest of the way. He walked to the Indian chief, his steps steady, deliberate. The soldiers parted, forming a corridor of honor as he mounted the bike. The engine roared to life, its deep growl a defiant hymn against the fading light. Dan gave a single nod to Caldwell, then eased the throttle, the bike carrying him down Highway 81 as the soldiers saluted in unison. The crowd watched in silence, some with tears streaking their faces. A young girl no older than 10 tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mom, he's a hero, isn't he? Her mother nodded, her voice choked. Yes, sweetheart, and we almost forgot that. Emily stood frozen, her sunglasses now off, her eyes red. Ryan looked away, his earlier grin replaced by shame. The Humvees rolled out, their engines fading into the distance. But the weight of what had happened lingered. Across the street, Tom Brady returned to his station, his hands shaking as he wiped down the counter. He'd known Dan was a good man, but a general? A hero who'd shaped the very soldiers who just stood for him? Tom's mind raced back to his own service, to the men like Dan, who'd led him through the chaos of war. He thought of the times he'd felt invisible, reduced to just a vet in a world that moved on. Today, though, Dan Whitaker had reminded them all heroes don't fade, they endure. As the sun sank below the horizon, Dan rode on, the Indian chief's rumble echoing through the Nebraska plains. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The road stretched ahead, and so did his story. A story that York, Nebraska would never forget. The Nebraska sky burned with the deep amber of dusk as Daniel Dan Whitaker's 1969 Indian chief rumbled down Highway 81, its roar fading into the quiet plains. The events at the York intersection lingered like a storm that had passed but left the air charged. The townsfolk dispersed, their phones now heavy with videos of General Whitaker's stand, already spreading across social media with captions like "Heroes Shamed by Cops" and "Never Judge a Book by its Cover." The weight of the moment clung to Officer Emily Carter, who stood by her cruiser, her mirrored sunglasses tucked into her pocket, her face a mask of regret. Officer Ryan Delgado leaned against the car, silent, his usual smirk gone. They'd crossed a line, and the town, maybe the world, was watching. At the York Police Department, Sheriff Laura Bennett, 50, a no-nonsense veteran of 18 years, sat at her desk, her phone pressed to her ear. The call from Major Nathan Caldwell at Offutt Air Force Base was still fresh, his voice calm but unyielding. "Sheriff, General Whitaker isn't pressing charges. He doesn't want to ruin careers. But the Army expects better. Your officers need to understand what service means, what respect means." Laura nodded, though he couldn't see it. She'd known Emily Carter for 4 years. Sharp, dedicated, but sometimes too quick to act. Ryan was newer, eager but green. They'd meant well, but good intentions didn't erase bad judgment. "It'll be handled, Major," she said. "You have my word." By Monday, the precinct buzzed with tension. Laura gathered every officer in the briefing room, her voice steady but firm. "Starting this week, we're implementing new protocols for field encounters. Every one of you will attend a training program at Offutt Air Force Base. You'll learn what it means to serve, what it means to honor those who've given everything for this country." Her eyes swept the room, landing on Emily, who sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly. "We don't just enforce laws. We protect people, their dignity, their stories. Last week we failed at that." "Never again." Emily stood, her voice trembling but clear. "Sheriff, I made a mistake. I disrespected a man who deserved better, a hero. I judged him by his age, his bike, and I was wrong." She paused, her eyes meeting her colleagues. "But it's not just about General Whitaker. It's about every person we meet. They all carry something we can't see." "I learned that the hard way." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Laura nodded, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "That's the start, Carter. Now let's make it right." 2 days later, Emily's cruiser rolled down a gravel road off Highway 81, dust trailing behind her. Her hands gripped the wheel, her heart pounding like it had at the intersection. Dan's ranch came into view, a simple white farmhouse, its porch adorned with 2 rocking chairs, a vibrant garden blooming with marigolds and zinnias, and his 1965 Ford tractor parked beside a weathered barn. The Indian chief rested under a sprawling oak, its chrome glinting in the morning light. Emily parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out, her uniform crisp, but her posture uncertain. She wasn't here as an officer. She was here as a person, seeking forgiveness. Dan slid out from under the tractor, his coverall streaked with grease. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gray eyes meeting hers with the same calm intensity she'd faced before. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice neutral. "Something I can help you with?" Emily swallowed, her prepared words faltering. "General Whitaker, sir? I came to apologize. What I did was wrong. I judged you without knowing you, and I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I want to understand, really understand, what I missed, if you'll let me." Dan studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the porch. "Got coffee inside, fresh pot. Come on." They walked in silence, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound. Inside, the kitchen was modest: wooden table, blue ceramic mugs, a window framing the endless Nebraska fields. Dan poured coffee, handed her a mug, and sat across from her. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. "Officer," Dan said finally, "why'd you join the force?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I wanted to make a difference. Keep people safe, Help my community." Dan nodded, sipping his coffee. "How many accidents have you seen caused by folks my age?" She hesitated, the truth dawning. "Not many. Most are younger. Speeding distracted. Drunk." She looked down at her mug, shame creeping in. "I assumed you were the problem because of how you looked. I was wrong." Dan leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window where his cattle grazed. "Respect isn't about a badge or a rank. It's about seeing the person in front of you, not their age, not their clothes, not their ride. You didn't see me that day. You saw an old man. That's where you lost your way." Emily's eyes stung, but she held his gaze. "I see you now, sir, and I'll do better. I promise." Her voice broke, a tear escaping. She wiped it away quickly, but Dan saw it. His expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. He'd seen that look before, on young soldiers, raw and eager, learning hard lessons in the heat of battle. Emily wasn't so different. "You're young," Dan said. "You'll make mistakes. But you're here now. That's a start." He stood, walking to a shelf where a small wooden box sat, its edges worn smooth. He opened it, pulling out a faded photograph. A younger Dan in uniform, surrounded by soldiers in a desert camp. "These men," he said, his voice quiet, "they trusted me to bring them home. Some didn't make it, but every one of them had a story. Just like you. Just like me." Emily stared at the photo, her throat tight. She saw the weight in his eyes, the kind that came from carrying lives, losses, and victories across decades. "Sir," she whispered, "how do you keep